I love this, oops. I love this silence because it's Good Friday, I mean, you know. Dentro de poco vamos a tener como la procesión. Okay, I think I'm going to start slowly because we would like to have more time for our invited guest to talk to us. But I would like to give some remarks at the beginning as always. First of all, I would like to take the opportunity to thank each of you for and welcome you at this year's KFLC. The majority of you know that this is a conference that has been running since 1948, and we are very proud to host this conference here at UK, one of the longest running conferences in linguistics, cultural studies, literature, pedagogy, and technology, anyway. So I would like to recognize, first of all, the hard work and guidance of the Executive Committee and thank the University of Kentucky College of Arts and Sciences for their support, as always. In the Dean's Office or in our college, I would like to thank Noah Adler for the website and online abstract and administration. We appreciate also the contributions of Nina Zacharia, who graciously provides us with technical support throughout the conference. Also, we would like to thank Edwina Taylor for all her hard work with our many catering needs, although they've been a little bit expensive this year, but anyway. Finally, many thanks to Noah Rice, Chris Hensley, and Joe Willey in the business office. Of course, our speakers, without them, we wouldn't have this wonderful conference here. The organizers, chairs, participants, and dedicated volunteers. I mean, this year we had a shortage of TAs because of what's going on, of course, in higher education anyway. But many of the undergraduate students stepped up and helped us a lot, and I would like really underline my big thank to them. But without the help of my assistant director, Daniel Batten, who always hides himself, he doesn't like these words, this wouldn't have been possible. Very good. And together with the help of Hayden Holman, the Assistant Director of Hispanic Studies, they brought the conference to another level. Please give them a warm applause, both of them. Thank you. But of course, we also have a lot of sponsors. I would like to, go through them, like my department, the Department of Hispanic Studies, MCLLC, also the Modern Classical Languages and Literatures Department, Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies Program, the Department of Linguistics, the International Center, Jewish Studies Program, and Lewis Honors College. Not to forget our generous sponsors of the Bluegrass Community College this year, especially Joshua Högstra, who have been very, very helpful with the facilities and the spaces, because as you might have seen, we have a lot of construction going on campus. So we could use today their facilities. And especially Joshua has been really a big help with this. Of course, Vista Higher Learning and the Spanish Institute for Global Education for the generous support for this year's conference. And I wouldn't like to forget my husband, Randy Sermons, who always comes up with donations so we can cover the drinks. Because otherwise, yes, this needs to be, please. Yeah. Before we start, in these turbulent times marked by global uncertainty, cultural polarization, and shifting academic landscapes, conferences like ours serve as vital spaces for dialogue, reflection, and connection. They remind us of the enduring power of language, literature, and cultural exchange to bridge divides and foster understanding across disciplines and borders. KFLC not only celebrates intellectual collaboration, but also reinforces values of openness, resilience, and community that are more crucial now than ever. In gathering to share research, stories, and perspectives, we reaffirm our commitment to the transformative role of the humanities in a rapidly changing world, unfortunately. And, of course, now we are coming to the first nice part. I would like to thank again my colleague, and professor of guitar in the School of Music, Dieter Hennings Geoman. You know, he's been always a great supporter of this conference, not only part of our Latino community in Lexington, but now, you know, for the last years also of our KFLC community, and he has brought here his wonderful students to start the conference with a piece. I think he would like to say what the pieces are.
After I talk, they come and play? After I talk, or do I give the microphone back?
¿Cómo?
Después de que yo hable, ¿ya vienen ellos a tocar? ¿O te
Sí, sí, pues como 5 minutos, una pieza o algo.
Sí, sí, perfecto.
Okay.
It's a real pleasure to be with you today. My name is Dieter Hennings-Jomans. Although my name is Dieter Hennings-Jomans, I am from Hermosillo, Mexico. And ¿qué es esto? And it's a real pleasure to always be with you here. This is one of my favorite days in the academic year at campus because it's an international day. It's a day of immigrants. It's a day of friendship. And I'm very happy that you're all here. And today, normally I play for you every year. I've done that. Sometimes okay, sometimes not okay.
No.
Professor Simeonides always tells me afterwards. But today I brought two of my wonderful doctoral students from Mexico, Daniel Arriola Preciado and Daniel Monroy Reyes, who will perform a duo by the Cuban composer Leo Brauer. Speaking of immigration, this is the Sonata de los Viajeros, the Traveler's Sonata, which is sort of a global landscape of the classical guitar music. So you will hear first a fast movement that is a little bit more modern in its harmonic landscape, but it has then a visit of Bach, and the introduction is called Bach.
that was a nice way to start and get into our today's invited speaker and start revisiting standardization of languages. But let me just introduce our wonderful speaker tonight. Carla Amorós Negre is an associate professor for general linguistics at the University of Salamanca. Her main areas of research are language policy and planning, sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, linguistic anthropology, and the acquisition and learning of foreign languages. She has been a visiting researcher at the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh and at Fachbereich 10 Sprach- und Literaturwissenschaften at the University of Bremen. She is the Associate Director of the official Master's Program, The Teaching of Spanish as a Foreign Language at the University of Salamanca and the Director of the University Masters in Hispanic Language and Culture. She has published articles in internationally renowned journals such as Language Problems and Language Planning, Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, Current Issues in Language Planning, International Journal of the Sociology of Language, Journal of Spanish Language Teaching and Sociolinguística Internationales Jahrbuch für Europäische Soziolinguistik. She is also the author of 4 monographs, Norma y Estandarización de 2008, Las lenguas en la sociedad 2014, La estandarización lingüística de los relativos en el mundo hispánico, una aproximación empírica en 2018, sorry, I'm just reading everything in Spanish, and Didáctica de la lingüística general, temario y propuesta pedagógica 2021. She's currently leading a research project funded by the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation titled Revisiting Language Standardization, Mediatization, Vernacularization, and Language Ideologies in Contemporary Spain. Something that I forgot to add is it just came up like a week ago. Also, a book on a linguistic landscape. And I just need to add something also to that. Carla is not just a wonderful researcher, she's also a very generous colleague. I mean, the field of linguistic landscape was new to me, and she generously took me into that after, we were exchanging some kind of pictures when I was in Greece. And then she said, you need to do something in linguistic landscape about this, And she's always there when you need help. And she will be also, she will be in 2 committees of our students here at my department. So give a warm welcome to Carla, who came all the way here from Spain.
So, thanks very much for this warm presentation. It is an honor for me to be here today delivering this opening speech at this great conference, the Kentucky Foreign Language Conference, which attracts so many people and researchers, and of which I had heard so much. I would like to thank all the sponsors who make this event possible, and especially the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of Kentucky, and of course the soul of this great event, my colleague and friend, Professor of Hispanic Linguistics, Carla Amorós Negre, for the invitation and the warm reception. To all of you, thank you for being here, and I hope you think it has been a good use of your time. So, I have used the term revisiting to emphasize the new approaches being taken in contemporary studies on language standardization. my intervention will focus on what I consider to be the key characteristics of normativity management in this so-called late modernity, which has undeniably contributed to the linguistic decentralization and the territorialization processes of standard language cultures. In fact, the social linguistics of globalization and mobility has challenged the linguistic postulates based on homogeneity, territoriality, and stability, which were developed within the framework of modernity and nation states. So let's begin. Hacker, citing the Oxford English Dictionary, refers to the notion of standard as an authorized or recognized exemplar of correctness, perfection, whose earliest usages in relation to language date back to the 18th century. Of course, Renaissance humanism had already promoted the codification of European vernacular languages based on the framework of the classical languages, Latin, Greek. As Professor John Joseph showed, the first standard language of the West was the Greek Koine of the classical period. Language standardization is a process that involves more socio-political and socio-historical aspects than purely linguistic ones. The Danish linguist Otto Jespersen referred to the emergence of standard languages as the greatest and most important phenomenon of the evolution of language in historic times. And I would add that standardization is also one of the most debated social-linguistic phenomena, starting with the meaning of the term itself and including debates on its nature, scope, and consequences. Professor Awa, among many others, has recently defined the standard as a linguistic variety that follows a normative pattern and possesses three key characteristics. It is used by speakers who also use other regional, vernacular, or social forms of language. It's perceived as a high-status variety. It is regarded as a prestigious form, predominantly used in formal situations and in written contexts. These three dimensions are gradual and constantly being redefined, meaning that standards are dynamic and changing entities, and also that the degree of standardization can vary depending on how well these criteria are met and how they interact. Despite the exponential development of studies on comparative standardology, which we will discuss later, the classic model proposed by Einar Haugen is still used as a reference in standardization studies. It was Haugen himself who, in language conflict and language planning, the case of modern Norwegian, as you can see, defined language standardization as a type, the activity of a writer, an institution, a government in adopting and attempting to spread the language form that has been selected and codified. So he gave scientific legitimacy to the practice of activities aimed at deliberately influencing language, a practice that had, however, been taking place since the beginnings of human reflections on language use. Haugen's theoretical model distinguished four gradual phases or stages in the standardization process: selection of a variety, codification of the norm of that variety, implementation of that in the community, and functional elaboration. Dolmert and Van den Busche, in their brilliant work about Germanic standardization, refer to implementation as the Achilles heel of the process, because it determines the success or failure of the codification proposals for a variety. Undoubtedly, without the acceptance of linguistic rules by the speech community, the standardization process can never take place. In this respect, it is very important to make the distinction between, we would say, early selection standard languages, whose emergence took place more or less circumstantially at the end of the Middle Ages or in the early modern period, and the late selection standard languages, which occur at the end of the 18th century and especially during the 19th and 20th centuries, a process essentially tied to the sociopolitical and philosophical project of European modernity. As a general rule, the standards of the first type were also characterized by being dominant languages in their territory. We have French, Spanish, German, and so. By taking Latin as a model of language planning, these vernacular-based common languages precisely challenge Latin's monopoly over high written culture. The development of these mature standard languages was not the result of a process of change as deliberate as that which characterizes late standards that emerged in the 18th and 19th century, a time of consolidation of many European nation states, and of course the rise of nationalism. It was at this time when the rise of standard languages was politically instrumentalized, and beginning in France, seeking to homogenize the population through a single national culture and language. Language standardization thus served as a tool to unify speakers of different vernaculars and to foster a shared sense of community and identity, aligning with the broader socio-political and philosophical objectives of modernity, which include, of course, governmental centralization, the expansion of state administration, and urbanization. As a result, from the modern era onward, this socio-cognitive construct of a particular cultivated form of language, the standard, became dominant across Europe. And precisely one of the linguistic consequences of the creation of European nation states was the minoritization of ethnic groups whose linguistic practices and cultural patterns did not align with the monoglossic and monocultural state model. The promotion of a single national language, which came to be regarded as the sole symbol of prestige and national identity, closely associated with the dominant classes, resulted in clear economic and social discrimination against those who were redefined as minority groups. It's at this time that we have the concept that appears, the concept minority. As Professor Susan Gall, anthropologist and linguist Susan Gall, explains in this framework. Until the 18th century, language standardization affected only or primarily the written language. It was not until the 19th century that oral standards began to emerge. Of course, the 19th century is particularly significant in the story of standard languages, as it marked the time where large segments of the population gained access to cultivated standards, primarily due to the spread of literacy and, of course, the proliferation of printed materials. And, of course, the spread of standard languages would be consolidated through the work of schools, media, and so on in the 20th century. In this regard, I believe it is essential to highlight the importance of recent work in the field of standardology, and both synchronic and historical sociolinguistics, which are precisely challenging traditional narratives and history of standardization of some European languages, particularly those of early standard languages as English or French or Spanish. As recent monographs like you have here shown the origins of many of the earliest standards in Europe may have had a more plurilectal and complementary origin than what traditional history of language standardization documented until recently. The work and analysis of unofficial documents have often been obscure and overlooked by the ideology of standardization itself, which until recently did not pay sufficient attention to the informal and multilingual written linguistic practices of speakers during the medieval and Renaissance periods. Until standards became widespread among the population well into the 19th century, there was much more linguistic hybridity and heterogeneity than homogenization in many European languages than it was previously thought. To trace the different and individual histories of language standardization, attention should not be directed solely to formal, literary, bureaucratic, and legal text, but also to more private, everyday written documents such as letters, diaries. This bottom-up approach, or the language standardization from below, as it has been called, allows us to analyze how it progresses, how the standard took root in the speech community, and in particular, how linguistic regulations and prescriptions imposed from above were and are currently adopted or rejected by speakers themselves, as PLA shows, for example, in this schema. Regarding the creation of late standard languages, language planners tended to establish a much closer relationship between the spoken and written standards. Late standard languages also arise in contexts where multilingual practices among speakers were much more common. Language boundaries were more fluid, and the norms of correctness were not as rigidly established, we could say. As a result, these are often much more contested in terms of their legitimacy, with challenges coming from within the community and also from external sources. This is especially visible in the standardization of European minority languages, whose consolidation in fields such as media, education, administration, or science, in most cases, still lacking. So I am particularly thinking about the situation in Spain, about Catalan, Basque, or Galician languages in Spain, in contrast with the early standardization of the Castilian or Spanish language in the Iberian Peninsula. We are really interested, as Lane, Costa, or Hali de Corner said, focusing on ground level processes and participants to know in which ways the standardizing of minority languages reinvent or echo these processes of language standardization from the 18th century. And from my point of view, sometimes the sociopolitical subordination as a starting point to reverse the situation of minority languages grants those standards very often a different social indexicality. As we have tried to explain in some of these publications and in the ongoing project Language Standardization Revisited, as Professor Simeonidis referred to before. So in the case of Spain, there is a clear difference between the making of Spanish as standard language, which began early at the start of early modern period, and the standards of Catalan, Galician, and Basque, whose formal and functional standardization did not experience a qualitative leap until the 20th century. And of course, very incipient is the standardization of other languages of Spain, as you have here, for example, Aragonese, Astur-Leonese, and so on. So, Castilian Spanish, already a prestigious and highly regarded language, particularly since the 16th century, had experienced unprecedented international expansion during the reign of Emperor Charles I, and emerged as the victorious language in the institutionalization of a monoglossic national culture. The ascension to the throne of Philip V marked a turning point in the instrumentalization of the Spanish language to serve the political and ideological goals of nation-state building. First, of course, in the Spanish state, and later the Hispanic American republics. The other peninsular languages, here we have Catalan, Galician, Basque, and others, but also, of course, the indigenous languages in America, Quechua, Nahuatl, Guarani, Aymara, and so on, were largely excluded from the imagined national community building project on both sides of the Atlantic, as these 18th century texts demonstrate. We have here two decrees which have an extraordinary glottopolitical significance, would say my dear Professor José del Valle, in the establishment of a monoglossic Spanish culture, because these texts reflect the meta-discourse that enregistered Spanish as the sole language capable of achieving unity and social cohesion. Explicit corpus and status planning measures were taken from the 18th century that positioned Spanish in a superordinate role. The centralist spirit was reflected in the state's direct interventionism in the language question, starting with the creation of an academy on the model of the Académie Française, la Real Academia Española, under the rule of Philip V. This would contribute to the iconicity of Castilian Spanish as a national symbol. It was, however, Charles III who most decisively and explicitly supported monolingualism in Spanish. His clear intention to extend the general language of the nation, as we have here, to all corners of the empire is evident in the Royal Decree of 1768, that one, considering that the mandatory use of Castilian in education had not yet been fully implemented across the Iberian Peninsula, where a diglossic situation developed around the 18th century. His language policy enforcing Castilian was, though, even more forcefully articulated and had more damaging consequences with the enactment of the Pragmatic Sanction of 1770, aimed at the Americas and the Philippines. You have it there as well. Because indigenous languages were considered an obstacle to economic and cultural progress and an impediment to consolidate the national identity of the newly born states. And even when certain Amerindian languages were given status, I'm thinking about the constitutions of Paraguay and Ecuador, which held Guarani and Quechua respectively as national languages alongside Spanish, and Quechua and Aymara became co-official in Peru as well. In practice, Amerindian languages were mostly silenced in the public sphere. So our turning to the past is, as always, a way to better understand and make sense of the present, and to critically analyze how all forms of nationalism, including linguistic nationalism, are impoverishing for all communities. Aside from a more technical and formal approach in standardization studies, as exemplified in the works following Haugen's legacy, and without undermining the great debt we owe to the Norwegian linguists, the latest trends in standardization studies follow the theoretical and methodological shift of third-wave sociolinguistics, and focus specifically on uncovering how language standardization, ideologies and processes are discursively constructed and enacted in multilingual contexts, as Professor McLellan states. Keeping in mind that what is considered standard or not has much more to do with the notions of correctness held by the so-called well-educated people, that is, the standard language ideology, than with the amount of exposure or prevalence of certain uses. Professor Iris Bennett, in one of the latest and most comprehensive handbook on language standardization, precisely highlights the limitations that some of us have identified in Haugen's traditional four-phase model. These include the reductionism of a proposal that is only vertically oriented, its teleological nature, and also, I would say, its neglect of the sociopolitical and ideological implications of the process. In fact, the circularity inherent in the standardization process shows that we must pay attention to other processes of normative reorganization, such as re-standardization, de-standardization, demonetization, as this renew framework illustrates. Thus, the most recent studies in standardology emphasize the need to shift focus towards the bottom-up, non-institutionalized facets of the process. That is, to speakers' attitudes and ideologies concerning the emergence, configuration, and development of language models and standard varieties. Needless to say that any standard variety is not linguistically superior to any other non-standard variety, as language science has demonstrated. However, its association with the use of sociocultural powerful groups creates a social imbalance in linguistic equality within the variational system of language, of any language and linguistic community. It is not surprising, therefore, that alongside those who emphasize the historical nature of the standardization processes and its advantages, of course, promotion of a sense of unity and shared identity, facilitating interdialectal communication in transactional contexts, various linguists adopting a critical stance highlight the underlying monoglossic ideology that standardization can entail. This is because standardization has reinforced the idea of languages as fixed and monolithic entities, leading to the widespread diffusion and naturalization of the belief that one particular variety of a language, be it English, be it French, be it Swedish, be it Portuguese, whatever, is intrinsically better than others. As Milroy explain, standard language ideology helps to naturalize and legitimize the existence of hegemonic and subordinate language varieties and, of course, speakers. This is because the linguistic practices of a small group of people are taken as representative of what is standard or correct, from which hierarchies among languages, dialects, and so forth are established, as we saw in Gall's framework. The well-known standard language ideology leads to the general population's intolerance towards the intrinsic and natural variation present in all languages. Non-standard varieties, oral forms, repertoires, and ways of speaking that do not align with the linguistic ideal consecrated as standard undergo a process of erasure, even of their own structural complexities. It cannot be overlooked how standard language ideology, this idea that there is only a best way of speaking, can result in racial linguistic ideologies. As demonstrated by Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores, Jennifer Lehman and Jan Fuller, among others, these ideologies led to the delegitimization, rejection, and censorship of the linguistic practices of certain speaker groups, regardless of how closely those practices may align with or approximate a recognized standard or proper usage. We see this clearly in many media headlines and news outlets, such as in the case of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has also been linguistically criticized and delegitimized in media like Fox. She was even mocked for the way she pronounced her own name. She does the Latina thing, where she does her, you know, Anastasia Ocasio-Cortez, misstating her name and exaggerating the R with an affected accent, they say. It is far from trivial to denounce in a forum like this the linguistic racialization that an overwhelming number of people continue to endure in the 21st century. The concept of being racialized applies to those who are treated unequally because of how they are perceived racially or ethnically. This racialization is not produced solely through skin color or physical features, as Lara Alonso wrote. It can also be constructed in relation to national origin or language, as it is the case. Thus, the hegemonic status of Spanish in Spain, in Latin America, when we teach Spanish as a foreign language internationally, is in clear contrast with the minoritization and the minoritized status as a heritage language that has in many places, like in the US. Because the value of languages and the social and linguistical capital of their speakers always fluctuates depending on the geopolitical and social context in which certain linguistic features and repertoires are used. And I think this is something that social linguists should insist on always, in class, of course. Well, the revisionist position in standardization studies does not at any point deny the functionality, usefulness, or convenience of codifying and standardizing languages in many socio-linguistic contexts, though not all. And the use of the standard in formal situations, such as in a scientific conference like I am doing right now. However, it emphasizes the historical, political, and economic nature of these processes. In the past, processes of language codification and standardization were almost always conceptualized within the territorial boundaries of the nation state. But the sociopolitical, economic, cultural, and linguistic realities of the 21st century are radically different. The spread of liberal capitalism, privatization of services, technological revolution, global connectivity, and increased mobility and migration worldwide have led to a restructuring of all organizational systems, political, economic, social, cultural, and linguistic as well. The dynamics of the so-called network state is also influencing the management of normativity and the way we think about languages and languaging. Consequently, we think that the ideology of the standard language, that socio-cognitive construct of exemplarity, must also be re-examined in this late modernity, where we are attesting that hierarchization and changes in prestige are occurring in different linguistic communities. There is, we think, a continuum ranging from communities with very strong, rigid standard languages with highly hierarchical social usage norms, we could say, for example, in Belgium, to culture or less rigid standard languages, such as Norway, for example. As has been emphasized in recent sociolinguistic research, in many European media, even in the discourses produced by so-called model speakers, such as journalists, there is greater systematic and socially significant variation, manifested, for example, in regional or social accents. Not by chance, Coupland referred to vernacularization as a sociolinguistic change in process that is impacting the so-called standard language cultures and implies an ideological fracturing of previous standard vernacular indexical relations. Thus, several attitudinal experiments highlight that standard varieties are currently valued by speakers not only for their traditional qualities related to social power, uniformity, prestige, but also with descriptors of empathy and dynamism, such as confidence, clarity, intelligibility. There is therefore a great deal of research potential regarding how globalization, new media, and heteroglossic repertoires may influence the shaping of language standards and language varieties, and of course their language ideologies. In this respect, I would like to point out what I believe are the main characteristics of normativity management and standardization in Western languages in the present day. Please tell me about the time. Okay. It is increasingly evident that the codified or prescribed standards for the majority of European languages is expanding, in the sense that more than a single solution is accepted as model of good usage. The growing recognition of linguistic diversity has led to standardization becoming more compositional, that is, it incorporates a significant number of variants from different regions to facilitate adoption and acceptance across various speech communities. Standards also accept alternative solutions, as we can see from examples from Spanish, but also from Catalan. For instance, taking examples from Spanish, both the flat stress on words like football and video, as preferred in Spain and different Latin American countries, and acute stress variants football or video, more common in countries like Mexico and in Central America, are considered normative and part of this standard. This tendency also applies to decodification of minority languages like Catalan, as I told you. Linguistic features for different geographical varieties of Catalan have been progressively incorporated to the prescribed norm to facilitate standardization. Although description and prescription have alternated and alternate more or less intensely throughout different Western grammatical traditions, particularly since the 19th century, the use of covert prescription remains a constant in the codification and standardization of grammars, also in the 21st century. That is, they avoid an explicitly normative discourse of linguistic condemnation. This is the case with dictionary and grammars provided by standardized institutions, such as the various Spanish language academies and the Nueva Gramática de la Lengua Española, but also with other minority language management bodies, such as the Institut d'Estudis Catalans, which since 1907 has been responsible for the codification and standardization of the Catalan language across the entire Catalan-speaking community. And of course, we must refer to pluricentricity, a term which has become a common defining feature of most standard languages nowadays. Michael Klein, to whom we owe the popularization of the concept, following the work of Claus and Stewart, dealt with the distinction between monocentric and pluricentric standardizations. In contrast to languages that have a widely accepted norm considered appropriate with only minor modifications, there are those with multiple linguistic reference norms, as we see in one of the seminal works, Pluricentric Languages, Differing Norms in Different Nations. However, as has been emphasized, the very concept of pluricentricity reflects its origin in the sociolinguistics of nation building and the need to develop national standards distinct from those of their formal linguistic, sometimes colonial countries. For this reason, from my point of view, studies on pluricentricity must go well beyond the mere goal of identifying national varieties with the aim of abstracting linguistic centers that are not in fact such. We sociolinguists should not practice an aseptic study of pluricentricity, neglecting the inherently political nature of language variation, particularly with regard to power relations and hierarchies established among speakers and varieties in pluricentric languages. From a post-colonial framework, the ideological construction of standard varieties must figure prominently in our research agenda, and this implies paying attention to the processes of enregisterment through which certain language variants and varieties become emblematic for speakers, as well as the social values that they attribute as to standard forms as opposed to non-standard ones. Among the characteristics in the management of normativity nowadays, we must also refer to the existence of diaglossia as a continuum of relationships between standard and non-standard varieties. We are seeing, indeed, an increase in the dialectalization and regionalization of the standard on the one hand, and the adoption of standard characteristics by vernaculars on the other side. So everything is being more dynamic. And last but not least, a growing and very interesting line of current research is also the questioning of linguistic norms observed in certain less regulated communicative contexts. Some linguists have referred to de-standardizing trends in various standard language cultures, noting greater flexibility in ideologies, linguistic practices, and speakers' own discourses surrounding language correctness. Particularly in digital media, such as social networks, blogs, and also the linguistic landscape, standard language norms are being challenged. And I would like also to move on to conclude to this difference between standard language cultures and non-standard language cultures. As has been shown throughout this talk, the existence of what we might call the standard variety or language construct has been fundamental in the development of Western linguistics, serving as one of the means by which the intrinsic and universal linguistic normativity of every community has been channeled. However, it is neither a linguistic nor a cultural universal. Standardization is not a cultural universal. We must bear in mind that the evaluative and normative character associated with language is evident in all linguistic communities, not only in those with standard varieties. Because when we speak or write, we always orient ourselves in relation to a context of socially constituted norms. This is the kind of behavior that Deborah Cameron referred to as verbal hygiene. Verbal hygiene as normativity. But normativity is broadly understood as the efforts aimed at regulating or intervening in linguistic behavior, a general sociolinguistic phenomenon. It must be distinguished from the notion of prescriptivism. Institutional prescriptivism, above all, that refers specifically to forms of language regulation and planning carried out top-down by linguistic authorities. A non-prescriptive notion of normativity has not such authority, of course, apart from the social control provided by the society, the speakers themselves. This grassroots prescriptivism, in terms of Lukács, refers to informal practices by speakers themselves who evaluate and judge language usages and behaviors. Nevertheless, we cannot forget that such practices also contribute to enhancing the prestige of certain varieties and their speakers, while conversely stigmatizing others. In language ecologies characterized by dynamic and complex multilingualism, many of them sociolinguistic environments with primarily oral traditions, the concept of correctness and incorrectness are not prevalent. Instead, what exists is a range of linguistic repertoires considered appropriate or not for the context, or effective for achieving a specific communicative purpose. Language planning and management experiences in indigenous communities often demonstrate speakers' rejection of standardization. And disagreements usually arise when selecting a particular writing system for a previously unwritten language. Among the arguments typically put forward to promote the standardization of languages with primarily oral traditions are the contributions it makes to their preservation, the enhancement of their stages and functionality, and the potential for the language to gain prestige and legitimacy. As Salamanca and others explain in the book Creating Orthographies for Endangered Languages, a standard writing system is often seen as necessary for language promotion and for the development of formal teaching materials. Indeed, it may also help create a sense of unified identity among the speakers. Nevertheless, language standardization in known Western ecologies also faces significant challenges. Linguists and anthropologists must carefully evaluate whether the creation of a written system and subsequent elaboration of a consensual standard would find real application in the life of the speakers, who must find an incentive in the development and learning of a standard. They must also determine whether agreeing on a written norm would bring more benefits than intergroup conflicts. To analyze the ambiguous attitudes toward codification and standardization and its appropriation in different ethno-linguistic communities, we must not forget to ask ourselves under what conditions and assumptions standardization can aid in the revitalization of languages with really a few amount of speakers and the empowerment of the speakers themselves. The convenience of unifying languages through writing and the need for standardization has been clear in most European and Western languages, but the creation of a standard for a vulnerable, endangered, and minority language can also have the opposite effect, especially in highly multilingual ecologies in the Pacific, America, or Africa, if speakers consider the codified or standard variety too distant from their vernacular and show negative attitudes towards the new variety. And I just wanted to end here and leave here this quotation from Professor Susan Wright, with whom I had the privilege to work with. She was wondering if the sociolinguistics of globalization and Blomer's work ask us to move away from this national language paradigm, and of course we celebrate linguistic hybridity provoked by the globalization. But of course, if we approach language in this way, we have to dispense with language planning in the nation-state mold. And if this vision is really the future or not, this is something we will have to analyze. I think in the next decades, we have a lot of work to do. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Actually think about what we might be doing wrong, you know, this standardization and how instead of helping minority languages, what could be done differently. I suppose this is not working. Okay, because I would like to take some questions and I would like to go around with so any questions, please? Yeah.
So since the topic of this conference is artificial
Speak out, please.
Since the topic of the conference is artificial intelligence, I'm wondering if the standardization is also replicated in artificial intelligence, in chatbots, in things like that.
Yes, it's a really interesting question. And what they are doing, of course, is sometimes taking the same steps as some language planners do. I'm thinking about not so standard languages that, of course, they have this artificiality, but also historicity, and they have to be implemented in a society. But I'm thinking about artificial languages, of course, regarding artificial intelligence, they are working, of course, with some patterns of homogenization, which are replicated some of the premises, of course. Yes. Natural processing, yeah.
Sorry for the mic.
Yeah, sorry about my cold and my voice.
Any other questions? Please.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you think there's a connection between standard language ideology and the resistance to inclusive language, to the X, to the E, and the way that people are so open to aggressively attack people who are proposing challenges to language, changes to language.
Of course, completely. I think it's like they see it, and it's like it's the grammar and the grammar, of course, the grammar and language changes with social usage, and of course this resistance has to do with the standard language ideologies and all of this idea of language as a bounded entity with close boundaries, you know, and this, yeah, of course, this monolithic vision of language. Of course, we are, this is very interesting, and also how also different normative agencies are dealing with this question, because it's different also in the different Spanish-speaking countries, for example, the way the non-binary gender is, for example, used in Chile or in Argentina, it's much more used than in Spain, for example. And it's, the use of chiques, for example, is regretted and is censored by the Spanish language academy, as the language academies, of course. That's the thing.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Like election in my country, shouldn't we just go into the variety of the language, so which problematize
Which country?
Japan?
Japan.
So for example, I speak different types of Japanese. Standard Japanese, Hiroshima dialect, I'm from Hiroshima dialect, and formal Japanese. Yeah, and when I speak to informal situation like this, of course I speak formal Japanese. When I talk to my sister brother in Hiroshima dialect, and when I speak to friends out of Hiroshima, I speak standard language. But we never even talk about standardizing. We just distinguish the situation using an English language. We never see that problem or anything like that. Yeah, so standardizing language is hardware. We never even try to do that. So, same kind of, besides nowadays, of course we have a media. Yeah, and for example, standard Japanese, I never learned from anything. I was like watching it, yeah, naturally learn. But it's just so easy to learn the standard language. Yeah,
But the standard Japanese you were talking about is different from the formal Japanese in which sense?
Standard Japanese, what I mean, formal Japanese is like formal situation like this.
Yeah, it's like a register, yes.
Yeah, standard Japanese, what I meant is, it's not really formal, but when I talk to for example, when I talk with my friends in Tokyo, that's a type of language I use. It's not formal. Yeah, but it is different from social dialect. Yeah.
But it is different in pronunciation, in lexicon, in everything.
Not
You use,
everything.
you use more like what they speak about this construct of general Spanish, or it's like a general language nobody, because standard Japanese, I presume, is not the native language of anyone in Japan.
Native language for like people in Tokyo, but any other area, probably not. Yeah. So,
You have to learn standard Japanese, don't you?
I've never learned it, actually. Yeah, it's just watching TV and it just comes naturally. Yeah, so, but the question is there any big conflict or big demonstration or something like that in order to keep the language or maybe, let's say, Hiroshima dialect has to be standard language.
I think
It's
there
kind
are.
of crazy, probably. Yeah.
I think there are, but there are no big demonstrations regarding this should be a standard or not. We have, for example, of course, we have demonstrations regarding minority languages because they want to be, they want to survive. And we have, for example, demonstrations, and we have a lot of language activism, for example, regarding the Asturian language, because it's not official, and of course it's not gaining new speakers, but not about standardizing new languages. Not if we don't have this type of debates nowadays. In the sense of making new standard languages, we have, of course, these some languages which are in a really, I would say, early stage of standardization because they only have a grammar, maybe a dictionary, and they cannot be used in education. So of course they need this standard, so it's easier for them to access they systematically, because they don't speak that standard, which is sometimes a standard that is really the written one that we found in grammar books. And nobody uses normally this standard of the book, so that's what the discussion is going on. But it's so different. The situation regarding Japan, for example, is very different from the situation in China, and also from the situation of Tonghua or Standard Chinese, and the difference between, of course, Chinese as a macro language, and of course, for example, the Arabic case is really interesting because they only have the standard Arabic for the whole Arabic-speaking community, but they have a clear diglossic situation. Nobody speaks this standard Arabic. Nobody speaks. So the difference between these oral and written versions of the language is total, is complete. So that is very different. If you go to Egypt, you cannot communicate orally. If you for example, have learned the Arab from zero, so that's why each standard language and its relation to the different varieties and dialects is a concrete case and a very, very special type of. For example, anyone in the Spanish-speaking community would have any problems communicating from someone from Spain, Uruguay, we wouldn't have any problems. This does not happen in China. Mandarin Chinese cannot speak Cantonese Chinese. They need a Tonghua.
I think there was information from
Yeah.
Albert. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm thinking about the last part and potential political applications in the United States. And I'm thinking of the officialization of English in the United States. And if you would wager that standardization protects Spanish, or the opposite, it would go against the conservation of Spanish.
But you think the standardization of Spanish in the United States, that it will protect Spanish maybe in this situation, in this particular situation?
I'm seeing the officialization of English, the disuse of Spanish perhaps, or the ordering it, trying to limit its use in these various settings. Do you think standardization can be a tool to protect, or do you not see it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it's needed because, sometimes there is more like of course, different varieties, and we have we talk always about Spanish in the United States, but Spanish because of course it's so complex and there are lots of different backgrounds, and I think people has to use their language, of course, with their heritage background, and I don't think there's a need for that to protect it from being. What is needed is, of course, to have policies that protect Spanish, and to have language policies, language education policies, and language education incentives, to have the opportunity to spread Spanish in the United States, of course. To have it, to be able to use Spanish in media, administration, but not specifically on the form of the language.
Sure. It's just an alarming situation right now.
I know, of course.
Motion of the minority.
Why, everybody's thinking about, oh my God, we is the United States is the fourth country when we consider the population, the Spanish-speaking population, and this type of measure of having English as an official language in a place where English is de facto an official language is sometimes that always covered with a covered policy, not to protect the other languages that are really needed. So, continue.
If there is no other question or intervention, I suppose I like to invite our last part of the